Do we create our thoughts, or do they come to us? Carl Jung suggested that thoughts are not something we generate, but rather something that takes hold of us. But what if this idea was already embedded in the Hebrew language itself? One of my favorite things to do with Hebrew word roots is to connect them to ideas already explored in philosophy, psychology, and science. This time, I'm breaking down the Hebrew word Chashav, a word that tells the entire story of how thoughts appear, evolve, and become something recognized. And in doing so, I'm also fact-checking Jung's theory through Hebrew.
Let me ask you about something you said earlier about revelation. So I've been very interested in what would you call it, the anthropological psychology of the development of thought. That's a good way of thinking about it, is that how is it that human beings came to think? Now, Carl Jung said something very interesting about thought, about typical thought, normative thought. And he said the typical person doesn't think. What happens to the typical person is that thoughts appear to them and they accept them as axiomatically true without further investigation. And I believe that to be the case. I think that in order to think critically, you have to set up in the theater of your imagination something that holds a proposition and defends it, and then an adversary or two adversaries that take it apart. And so you're actually producing a collective within that will then hash out the thought. But that's led me down the rabbit hole of trying to understand what we mean when we say something like, I thought, which would be the sort of thing that scientists would say when they're talking about how they do science. Well, I thought up my hypothesis. It's like, that's not much of an explanation there, buddy. Like, what do you mean you thought it up? Because you didn't know the hypothesis, let's say, yesterday, and now you do know it. And so how did you not know it then? And how do you know it now? And how is it that that new idea manifested itself? And the answer is always going to be, well, it came to me. And so that's the crucial thing I want to dive into.
Welcome to Fact Checking with Hebrew, where we decode truth from the words themselves. Hebrew is not just a language, it's a structure, a blueprint of reality. Jung's idea that thoughts come to us rather than being created by us isn't just a philosophical insight. It's woven into the very structure of the word Chashav itself. Let's break it down. A thought doesn't begin as something we consciously form. It arrives like a sudden spark, an intuitive flash. As a sensation, intuition, urgency, an electric impulse. The connection to electricity isn't accidental. It is two in the word. Our thoughts behave much like neurons firing like an unseen force triggering something within us, stirring, mixing, an unformed state of thought. The moment before a thought takes shape is a state of chaos, a swirling mix of emotions, sensations, and subconscious signals. In Aramaic, it means to whisper or to mix, reflecting this hidden process in our minds. It suggests that dreams, daydreams, hallucinations, and near-death experiences, NDEs, are also forms of thought. The word, returning, settling, taking form, derived from the same letter combination, describing that once a thought emerges from the subconscious, it doesn't disappear. It returns again and again, refining itself until it settles into something coherent. The same root appears in teshuvah, repentance, return, and Shabbat, the seventh day of creation, both linked to cycles of reflection and integration. The Hebrew word for praise, refinement, recognition reflects the final stage of thought. When it is fully formed, recognized for its value, and even praised. This could be the moment when an idea is articulated, shared, or honored as wisdom. When we put it all together, we see a clear sequence, the spark of intuition, an unseen impulse, the swirling, chaotic mix of subconscious processing, the return, refinement, and structuring of thought. Or, you may, consider this a piece of advice from the universe. Just sit with it, or even go back and reflect on it again. the recognition, articulation, and elevation of the thought. This perfectly aligns with Jung's idea that thoughts don't originate from us. Instead, they emerge, refine, and eventually become something we recognize as our own. The very structure of Hebrew validates this process. This word, along with other Hebrew words, teaches us that consciousness exists in everything, and it is the fusion of opposites that drives it toward realization. Think of two stones rubbing against each other to create fire. That fire, much like our thoughts, is pure consciousness. For anyone wondering where consciousness resides, this is your answer. So, the next time you find yourself deep in thought, remember, you're not just thinking. You're participating in an ancient encoded process already embedded in the very language of creation. When we analyze Hebrew words, we are not just studying language, we are uncovering the mechanics of existence. Every concept, every truth is already encoded in the words themselves. You don't need blind faith, you can test it yourself. In this series, we'll examine ancient and modern theories through Hebrew. Do thoughts own us? Is time linear? Does language shape perception? Let's decode reality together. Like, comment, and subscribe if you're ready to see the world through the lens of Hebrew.
Here's how I think the hypothesis generation process works. And scientists very rarely talk about this. They talk about the observable data, but they don't talk about the mechanism by which the investigative question was formulated. And that's a huge lacunae, right? That's a huge domain of unconsciousness. So this is how it seems to me, is that first of all, you have to have a problem. And so that's something that calls to you generally, because people are generally gripped by a problem, right? It isn't that they choose it voluntarily precisely. It comes knocking. They can open the door to it, but it's something that grips them and compels them. And it has a kind of autonomy in that sense. If something really besets you as a problem, you can't shake it. It dogs you. And that seems like a kind of autonomy on the part of the problem. And also, there's a million problems that could beset you, but some stand out against the background, right? I think that's equivalent to the burning bush, by the way. Anyway, so you have a problem, and you're searching humbly for a solution. And humbly, because you have to admit that you have a problem, and you have to admit that you don't know the answer. And then if you open yourself up, whatever the hell that means, you'll get a revelation. And the revelation will be an insight, where it'll be something that strikes you as probable or likely. And so that's the first element. That's the first two elements of thought. The first element is a felt lack, and that would be an admission of personal insufficiency on some vital front. The next would be the knocking, which is, I would like to know the answer. The next part of the sequence is a revelation, as far as I can tell. And something appears to you, and it springs out of the void for all intents and purposes, and you can say you thought it up. But you're not saying any more than it appeared to me. There's no more content in those two descriptive, approaches. And then once the revelation makes itself manifest, you can analyze it critically, or you can subject it to further empirical analysis and to the criticism of others. And it's that whole panoply of sequenced processes that make up thought. But there's a revelatory element to that seems to me to be irreducible. Now, the question is, from where does the revelation spring?
I would sympathize with that analysis very, very much. I think thought is a little bit like time. As Augustine said, everybody knows what time is until they try to define it. And I certainly think that the idea that it came to me, actually, it cogs in with my own experience of my limited success in mathematical research. It came to me. I think there are other dimensions, of course, as well. You're absolutely right to try to take this question of analyzing hypotheses deeper, because things often play a role that folk wouldn't think about, like dreams, like hunches, like intuition, and all this kind of thing. And whether it comes to us swelling up from the unconscious or all this kind of thing, because I wonder, let me step back from this 1 second. I wonder if we have to think in terms of different levels of revelation. For example, if I want to get to know you and you want to get to know me, it's no use me putting you into a tomography machine and looking at your brainwaves. I will never get to know you unless you reveal yourself to me. And usually that will be, you speak to me as you are now, and I speak to you. That is partly revelation. If you never say anything, I'll never get to know you. Now, those words that you use are coming from inside you, and they have to do with your mind and your brain and all that very sophisticated stuff that we really know very little about because we don't even know what consciousness is. But I wonder if above and beyond that kind of human level of revelation, or what wells up when we've looked at a problem or something else, what wells up in our minds, we have to have a separate category, which I would call divine revelation. Now, whether the two dovetail and flow into one another is an interesting matter, because if you go back to Genesis, one of the most interesting things is we're told we're made in the image of God, but it was God that told human beings to do biology. Name the animals. That's taxonomy. It's the fundamental intellectual discipline. I'm not going to do it for you. You do it for yourself. And so the capacity of human beings to think in that sense, whatever it really means, seems to me to be a reflection of their creator and possibly an evidence, if we extrapolate it, of his existence.